Welcome to Little Mizzlewick, where notices on the village board have a habit of travelling further than anyone expects. Tonight's story begins with 4 simple words pinned to the notice board and a quiet request that stirs the whole village. This is the story of a chess partner wanted and of an unexpected friendship that takes shape one move at a time. This is Wanted, a chess partner.
The gossip around the notice board. The notice board outside St. Jude's smelled of damp cork and furniture polish. Ivy curled around the weathered stone frame, and the morning drizzle had already made the edges of the older notices swell and soften. Nora Field arrived with her canvas bag and the little tin of drawing pins that had rattled in her pocket for years. Since retiring from the post office, she had kept the board in order with the quiet seriousness other people reserved for parish accounts or rose pruning. She looked over the week's offerings with her usual care. Lost scarf, Mrs. Pembridge's again, the blue cashmere one her son had sent from Canada, found glove, a child's mitten with no sign of its pair. Choir practice moved half an hour later because the organist's new hearing aid whistled at high G. Then she picked up a neat square of cream card, heavier than ordinary paper, the sort used for proper correspondence. Not flashy, just deliberate. Wanted a chess partner. The handwriting was careful and old-fashioned, each letter formed as if the writer had taken a breath before beginning. Nora pinned it at eye level beside the Harvest Festival poster, pressed the drawing pin in firmly, then dabbed a raindrop from the corner with her fingertip. She stood a moment longer than she needed to. There was nothing dramatic in 4 simple words, yet something in them stayed with her as she walked away. A little way off, Lucy Carter watched the morning's first commuters from the warmth of the station office. Beside her on the windowsill, Cinders, the Marmalade station cat, was busy grooming a stray patch of fur on his shoulder. Even from there, Lucy could tell when something had caught hold in the square. People slowed, heads turned, small clusters formed, then broke apart again. In Little Mizzlewick, the station and the church square were the 2 ends of a very busy grapevine. She watched a small cluster form around the notice board, dissolve and reform slightly differently, the way they always did when something new had appeared. A woman she didn't recognise from this distance paused longest, head tilted at the angle people used when they were reading something twice. Then she moved on. And Lucy had the distinct impression she was already composing what she would say about it to the first person she met. That was the particular quality of a notice that caught. Most of them didn't. Lost items, roomlets, yoga classes starting in January, these were absorbed and forgotten before the reader had reached the end of the street. But occasionally something pinned itself not just to the board but to the morning, and people carried it with them without quite meaning to. Lucy had seen it happen with the notice about the allotment waiting list, which had somehow become a 3-week conversation about land, community, and whether Derek Soames had jumped the queue in 2019. She had a feeling this one might have a similar reach, though for entirely different reasons. She poured herself a second cup of tea and watched the square settle back into its usual rhythm. Cinders shifted on the windowsill and tucked his paws underneath him with an air of total indifference to village affairs. By 9 o'clock, half the village had heard about it, though in truth it was Major Burns who had done most of the work. He stopped on his way past, heels ticking on the wet pavement, and read the board with the gravity of a man inspecting a document of national importance. "Ben Carter," he said. Though nobody had asked, and Mrs. Whitfield was only just getting her umbrella under control, trying to look clever again. All that time in London. He moved on with the brisk satisfaction of a man who felt he had contributed something useful. Mrs. Whitfield squinted after him, then at the card. "Do you think so?" Nora, who knew better than to answer too quickly, only gave a mild little smile and straightened the corner of the Harvest poster. A little later, Sarah Logan came from the general shop carrying 2 parcels and a pencil tucked behind one ear. She read the card, head tilted slightly. "Well," she said, "that's rather lovely." It might only be chess, Nora said. Sarah gave her a look. That's never all anything is round here. She studied the handwriting another moment. Whoever wrote it has been thinking about it for a while. At noon, Eleanor Vance appeared with a cloth bag of paperbacks for the library shelf inside the church hall. She read the notice and made the thoughtful sound she used when some small detail had caught her attention. Not a child, she said. Not Ben either. He does a very peculiar thing with his Ys. Nora's mouth twitched. Eleanor touched the edge of the card without disturbing it. And not written in haste. Proper paper, too. Henderson's stationery, I'd guess, or something like it. You've only looked at it for 10 seconds, said Nora. That was ample. By 1 o'clock, the notice had gathered a full, invisible audience. It moved from the board to the vestry, to the post office queue, to a loaf being wrapped in paper, to 2 men leaning on a gate and pretending to discuss the weather. It was not quite gossip and not quite concern. In Little Mizzlewick, people noticed when someone asked for company, even in so modest a form as a board game. That afternoon, in the snug of the Shepherd's Crook, Arthur Grimshaw polished glasses and gave every impression of not listening while the regulars speculated. "The vicar," said Tom Armitage, perfectly straight-faced. The table chuckled just as Reverend B. Hemlock came through the door in search of matches for the altar candles. "I heard that," she said. "And for the record, I do know how the horse one moves." "The knight," said Eleanor from her corner, without looking up from her crossword. "Yes, well, him," said B. "I know the idea of him." Arthur held a glass up to the light. "More than Leo knows about revision, then." That earned another round of laughter, and even B smiled as she took the matches and shook her head at them all. Nora sat near the fire, drying the cuffs of her coat. She said nothing about the card. Though she had begun to suspect its shape before the thing was half through, some notices came and went without consequence. Others shifted something. When she locked the noticeboard that evening and tied the little cord against the damp, the cream card sat behind the glass like a question waiting for the right person to answer it. The False Applicants. The first person to make a public show of rising to the challenge was Major Burns, which surprised nobody. On Friday evening, he strode into the Shepherd's Crook with a battered green box under one arm and an expression that suggested formal selection rather than social interest. "Army Champion, 1989, he announced to the snug at large. Arthur glanced up. "Was there a trophy?" "There was discipline," said the Major, which seemed to him sufficient. He set the box down on the back table and looked round for an opponent. His gaze settled on Alfie Crane, who had only just taken his first sip of pint and had the immediate look of a man regretting having left the house. "Nonsense," said the Major, when Alfie murmured that he was hardly a proper player. "Every Englishman should know his bishop from his knight." The chessman, when he tipped them onto the board, had the faint smell of old felt and long storage. The Major arranged them briskly and declared himself ready. Alfie sat because there seemed no decent way not to. Within minutes, the Major had begun shifting pieces with more confidence than accuracy. Alfie frowned once, then again. "I don't think that's right," he said. "Table's uneven," said the Major at once, glaring at Arthur as if faulty furniture were a matter of grave misconduct. Eleanor, looking over the rim of her glasses from 2 tables away, said mildly, "The table is perfectly adequate. The move was not." The snug grew interested. By move 6, Alfie, through a combination of caution, luck, and not overreaching, had trapped the Major's queen. 2 moves after that, he had, quite by accident, won the game. The laugh that went round the room was quickly disguised as coughing, throat-clearing, and an intense interest in tankards. "Standards have slipped," said the Major darkly, sweeping his pieces back into the box. "That is the root of most things." He departed with military emphasis. The following afternoon, Sarah Logan decided to have a go, bringing with her a tin of shortbread that still smelled of butter and warm sugar. "I'm sure I can manage one game," she said. Alfie, who was apparently the default opponent for the village's experimental chess period, looked resigned. Sarah made 3 brisk opening moves, offered him 2 biscuits, asked after his mother's hip, wondered aloud who had bought 6 jars of strawberry jam in one go, and only then glanced properly back at the board. By the time Arthur called time on tea and began looking meaningfully at the clock, the game had collapsed into village updates, biscuit crumbs, and a discussion about flowers left on Mrs. Patterson's grave. Sarah stood up and dusted her skirt. "Well, I can see the appeal of the company. Certainly, the actual game seems less me." Saturday evening brought Ben Carter and a tablet. "Chess has moved on," he announced, setting it on the table with the confidence of a man unveiling the future. "Digital boards, tournament analysis, AI opponents." "What's wrong with a board?" said Arthur. "Nothing. This is just smarter." Arthur made a small sound that suggested he reserved judgment. Ben connected to an online opponent after a short but intense disagreement with the pub Wi-Fi. A few people gathered round with the caution usually afforded to unfamiliar kitchen gadgets. The game began well enough, but the invisible opponent was patient in a way Ben was not. 10 minutes later, the screen informed him with tidy, impersonal efficiency that he had been soundly beaten. "Bit unfair," said Ben. "It's designed to win." Eleanor turned a page in her book. That was, I suspect, the broad concept. By Monday, Leo Turnbull had decided the whole thing was content gold. He arrived with a tripod, headphones round his neck, and the bright expression of a man convinced he was about to make something everyone else would later admit had been a splendid idea all along. "Live Village Chess Challenge," he said into his phone. "The bishop moves like a ninja," he declared on one turn, then swapped seats. But wait, the knight has other plans. He played both sides with absolute commitment and no lasting grasp of the rules. The final outcome was a dramatic self-inflicted disaster, which he narrated as though commenting on an international championship. His video went up that evening with triumphant music and several unnecessary close-ups. The following Tuesday brought Belinda Armitage, who had the organised energy of someone who had spent decades making sure things ran properly and saw no reason why chess should be any different. She arrived with a notebook. "I've done some reading," she said, setting it on the table beside the board. "Piece names, movement patterns, basic strategy. I've made notes." Alfie looked at the notebook, which was the small hardback kind with a ribbon marker, and then at Belinda with the expression of a man who had not volunteered for any of this. "Very thorough," he said. "Tom always said I over-prepare," said Belinda. "Tom is wrong about most things." She sat down, consulted her notes, and made her opening move with the precision of a woman who had decided to be good at this before she had established whether she was. For the first 4 moves she did extremely well, referring to the notebook only twice. On the 5th move she paused, turned back several pages as though the answer might be in an earlier chapter, and then looked up. "Can a rook go diagonally if the situation calls for it?" "It cannot," said Eleanor from her corner. "I thought, perhaps, with sufficient justification." "No justification," said Eleanor, "at all. Ever." Belinda nodded, made a different move, and continued with the cheerful determination of a woman who had once reorganised the entire village fete single-handedly and was not about to be defeated by a board game. The game reached a point where she had, through a sequence of small, confident errors, lost almost everything of value. "Well," she said, uncapping her pen and making a note, "I can see several things I'd approach differently." "Could you not just remember them?" said Alfie. Belinda looked at him the way she looked at Tom when he said something she found both wrong and not worth arguing. She wrote the note anyway. When Belinda left, she left the book on the table. Arthur put it behind the bar. The following Wednesday evening, just before closing, Reverend B. Hemlock came in carrying the church's ancient copy of the Oxford Companion to Chess, which she had found in the vestry behind a box of Harvest Festival bunting and a badminton racket of unknown provenance. "Research," she said, setting it on the table with the authority of someone consulting scripture. Arthur eyed the book. It was approximately the size and weight of a large hymnal. "You've been studying." "I've been preparing," said B, with the distinction of someone who felt the difference mattered. "There is a chapter on openings. I've marked several." She had used strips of paper torn from the order of service to mark no fewer than 11 pages. The game began. B opened with careful reference to her bookmarks, occasionally holding her place with one thumb while she moved a piece with the other hand. She was methodical in a way that was almost impressive until it became clear that understanding a move in theory and executing it against an actual opponent were related but distinct skills. "That's not quite," Alfie began. "I know," said B serenely. "I'm adapting." "To what?" "To circumstances." The game lasted 40 minutes, during which B consulted the book 7 times, apologised to her own bishop when she had to sacrifice it, and at one point asked whether there was any canonical guidance on the endgame. "There's a whole chapter," said Eleanor, who had given up pretending not to follow along. "Helpful. For people who have reached the endgame with pieces still on the board, which is a different situation to yours." B looked at the board, at the book, and then at Alfie with the serene expression of a woman who had delivered bad news in worse circumstances. "I think," she said, "that I may be more of a drafts person." She left the book on the table in case it was any use to anyone. Arthur put it behind the bar. The cream card stayed on the notice board through all of it, a little softened at one corner by rain, still waiting for the right person rather than the loudest one. "The committee," it began, as most things in Little Mizzlewick did, with someone saying someone ought to do something, and someone else agreeing, before either of them had thought carefully about what that something might be. Sarah Logan said it on Wednesday morning while restocking the biscuit shelf, and Ben Carter, who had come in for milk and a phone charger, agreed with the reflex of a man who had not been listening quite carefully enough. By lunchtime, Sarah had mentioned it to Leo Turnbull, who had mentioned it to Arthur, who had said he wanted nothing to do with it, and then found himself lending them the back room on Thursday afternoon when the pub was quiet. "We're not a committee," Arthur said, setting down 4 mugs of tea. "I want that noted." "Of course not," said Sarah. "We're just thinking together. That's a committee." "It's a conversation." Arthur sat down, which was as close as he was going to get to agreeing. The matter at hand was this. The chess notice had been up for nearly 2 weeks. Several people had attempted to answer it, none of them seriously. The real respondent, whoever it was, had not yet appeared. This bothered Sarah in the way that unresolved things bothered her, not urgently, but persistently, like a drawer that wouldn't quite close. "The point," she said, wrapping both hands around her mug, "is that someone wrote that card wanting genuine company, not a performance of chess, actual chess, with someone who means it. And we're going to find them," said Ben, with the confidence of a man who had solved exactly 0 human problems using technology and was about to try again. "We're going to think about who might be right," said Sarah, "which is different." "How is it different?" "One involves spreadsheets." Ben opened his laptop. "No spreadsheets," said Sarah. Ben closed it again. Leo had his phone out and was making what he called notes, and everyone else recognised as the early stages of content planning. He was trying to look merely thoughtful. "Who actually plays chess in the village?" said Arthur, who had decided that if he was here, he might as well be useful. "Properly, I mean. Not the people who think they probably could." There was a silence of the particular kind that follows a question nobody has a ready answer to. "Mr. Collins taught it," said Sarah. "Years ago, after school club." "He's a possibility then," said Ben. "He's very quiet," said Leo. "Quiet people play chess," said Sarah. That's rather the point of it. I only meant—" "I know what you meant." Arthur drank his tea. They went through the village methodically, in the way that felt productive while covering little actual ground. Various names were raised and examined and found to be implausible, on grounds ranging from lack of patience to a known tendency to rearrange the pieces when losing. Major Burns was dismissed in under 10 seconds. Belinda Armitage was considered and then set aside on the grounds that she had been seen taking notes during the game, which suggested enthusiasm rather than experience. Reverend B was considered briefly before everyone remembered the Oxford Companion incident, which had already made the rounds. "What about the handwriting?" said Leo. "I zoomed in on it." Everyone looked at him. "For a video," he added. "Which you posted," said Ben. "Creatively cropped," said Leo with dignity. "You couldn't tell what it was." "The comments section guessed," said Arthur. "Some of them," said Leo. "The regulars." Sarah turned her mug in a small circle. Eleanor said it wasn't written in haste, that it was deliberate. Someone who'd been thinking about asking for a while before they did. This produced a more useful silence. "That rules out anyone impulsive," said Ben. "That rules out you," said Leo. "I'm not impulsive. I just act quickly." "On incomplete information," said Arthur. Ben looked as though he wanted to argue and couldn't quite find the footing. Sarah tapped the table. "Someone who lives alone," she said, "or who has recently started to. Someone for whom chess specifically meant something." Arthur looked at his tea. He had a thought, the kind that arrives fully formed and quietly certain. He did not share it. He had known Mr. Collins for many years, had watched him come and go from the pub with decreasing frequency since Margaret died, had noticed the specific way a man sits at a bar when the house behind him is too quiet. He was not the sort to put two and two together loudly. "We're probably overthinking it," he said. Sarah looked at him with the expression of a woman who had known him long enough to read the edges of what he said. "You know, don't you? I have a suspicion. And it's not mine to say." He stood up and collected the mugs. "Whoever it is will turn up when they're ready. That's how these things work." Leo looked briefly at his phone, thought better of it, and put it away. "So, the committee achieved nothing," said Ben. "The conversation," said Sarah. "The conversation achieved nothing." Sarah considered this. Outside, a car went past. Someone's dog barked twice and stopped. "It achieved tea," she said, "and we know it isn't Major Burns." "We already knew that," said Leo. "We suspected it. Now we're certain." She stood and put on her coat. "That's progress." Arthur, washing mugs at the small sink, allowed himself a small smile that none of them saw. The notice stayed on the board. The right person had not yet appeared, but Thursday was coming. Elsie meets Mr. Collins. Thursday evening brought a fine mist that blurred the edges of the cottages and turned the street lamps hazy. Elsie Harper stood beneath the notice board with her school bag on one shoulder and her grandfather's chess set under the other arm. She was 14, bright in the quick, restless way of someone who had started to notice the limits of the village before she was old enough to leave it. The chess set had been sitting in her room for 2 years, shut away after Grandpa Joe's funeral. It was a beautiful thing, made of turned wood, each piece fitting into its own hollow inside the box. It had never seemed right to leave it there indefinitely, yet taking it out had felt like opening a door she had kept shut on purpose. She had passed the notice every day that week. Wanted a chess partner. Grandpa Joe had taught her on long summer afternoons while her parents were at work, speaking to her as if she were fully worth the effort of explanation from the beginning. He had never been patronising, which was one reason she had loved him so fiercely. Chess, he had told her once, was the most honest conversation two people could have. She had believed him. The trouble was that showing up at a pub with a chess set did not feel like something a normal 14-year-old ought to do, and Elsie was not wholly immune to embarrassment, whatever impression she sometimes gave. Still, she pushed open the heavy oak door of the Shepherd's Crook and stepped into warmth, wood smoke, and the low hum of talk. Arthur looked up from behind the bar. "Evening, Elsie. Bit late for a school night." "Gran's at knitting," she said. "She said I could wait here." Arthur's eyes flicked to the box in her arms and then back to her face. He had known Jo Harper well enough to recognise both the set and the expression with which it was being carried. "Pack tables free," he said. "Fire's up." She crossed to the snug, aware of a few glances, but determined not to care. The box opened with the old, familiar creak. She set out the pieces by habit, each one falling into place with the ease of muscle memory. Then she sat down, shoulders square, and waited. For a while, nobody came. Eleanor Vance lowered her book for a moment and watched. There was nothing pitiable about the girl, which somehow made the scene more affecting. Elsie was not pleading. She had simply turned up and made herself available, which in its own way required nerve. After 10 more minutes, Elsie looked once toward the door. Her face did not change much, but Arthur saw enough to know she was considering whether she had made a mistake. Then came a small cough. At the edge of the snug stood Mr. Collins of Ivy Cottage, tall and slightly stooped, cloth cap held in both hands. He was the sort of man people recognised without always quite placing. He attended church, nodded politely, and had been living quietly for so long that some people had begun to treat him as part of the background. "If no one else is coming," he said, "I should be glad of a game, if you don't mind." Elsie blinked. "You play?" He coloured a little. "I used to teach it, after school club, mathematics master, years ago." She looked at him properly then. "Only if you're prepared to lose." Arthur, turning away to conceal a smile, found something very interesting to do with a row of bottles. Mr. Collins sat opposite her and touched the pieces with careful familiarity, as if greeting people he had once known well. "White first," he said. Elsie nodded. They began. The game unfolds. Elsie opened, hard and fast, claiming the centre the way Grandpa Joe had taught her to. Mr. Collins did not rush. He looked at the board with full concentration, as if the game were worth the time it took to understand it. That alone made Elsie sit up a little straighter. "You've played properly," he said after a few moves. "My grandfather taught me. Joseph Harper." She glanced up. "You knew him." "We were on the parish council together for a term or two." "He was brilliant," she said, with a touch more force than she intended. Mr. Collins gave the smallest of smiles. "Then I shall try not to disgrace myself." Their styles could not have been less alike. Elsie pressed forward, intuitive and bold, sacrificing comfort for momentum. Mr. Collins built quietly, each move seeming modest until, several turns later, its purpose became clear. "You play," he said, after weathering one particularly fierce attack, like a train leaving before everyone's found their seat. She laughed. Better than never leaving at all. Round them, the pub carried on. Glasses clinked. A chair scraped. Someone near the bar had a strong opinion about lambing. None of it touched the board. For nearly an hour, the game drew its own weather around them. Elsie won material early. Mr. Collins ceded ground with suspicious grace. Slowly, the shape of the board changed until her advantage looked less comfortable than it had. "Your grandfather taught you very well," he said, making a move that shifted the whole feeling of the game. "Though I wonder whether he may have been kind in one or two places." She narrowed her eyes. "Meaning?" "Meaning good teachers do not always reveal everything at once." The remark annoyed her, only because part of her feared it might be true. While she was still considering it, Mr. Collins made another move, and suddenly the danger to her king became clear. "Oh," she muttered. He had seen much further ahead than she had. Then, just as the position seemed to close around her, Elsie spotted one reckless possibility. It was not elegant. Grandpa Joe might have raised an eyebrow at it, but it was alive. She sacrificed a piece. It was the kind of move Grandpa Joe would have recognised. Not careful, not safe, but alive in a way that mattered more than safety. She did not let herself think about that. Mr. Collins bent lower over the board. For a few seconds he did not move. Then his expression altered, first in surprise, then in dawning approval. "Well," he said softly, "there's a thing." The sacrifice had opened a line he had dismissed as harmless. Now his own king stood exposed, and Elsie's remaining pieces poured through the gap before he could repair it. He defended for several moves, but the outcome had turned. At last he studied the board, smiled with real pleasure, and gently toppled his king. Magnificent! Elsie was already reaching for the captured pieces. Again, Arthur glanced at the clock. Not on a school night. The words broke the spell a little, though not completely. For a moment, neither of them moved, as if the board had not yet informed the rest of the room that ordinary time had started again. Beyond the snug, someone laughed near the bar. A chair scraped. The front door opened and shut in a brief gust of damp air. Elsie sat back, still looking at the final position. She had the bright, disbelieving feeling that followed a really good game, when the room seemed faintly altered by it. Mr. Collins was smiling down at the board in a way that made him look younger, or perhaps simply less folded into himself. "You nearly had me 10 moves earlier," he said, still studying the pieces. "Nearly doesn't count." "No," he said, and there was real amusement in it. "I see that now." He began gathering his captured men with careful fingers, setting them in a neat row rather than returning them straight to the box. Elsie did the same without thinking. It gave the ending a small ceremony, as if the game deserved acknowledging properly before being put away. Arthur dried his hands on a cloth and gave the clock another meaningful glance. "You can resume hostilities another day." Mr. Collins rose and reached for his cap. "Would next Thursday suit?" he asked with an old-fashioned politeness that made it sound less like an arrangement and more like a request he would genuinely understand being refused. Elsie looked up at him. Whatever embarrassment had brought her through the pub door had gone entirely now. "If you think you can take another beating." His laugh surprised everyone near enough to hear it, not because it was loud, but because it came so cleanly, as though it had not been used properly in some time. Arthur turned away to hide his own expression and busied himself with a row of glasses that did not need attention. "I'll spend the week preparing for humiliation," Mr. Collins said. "Sensible," said Elsie. He inclined his head, still smiling, and went out into the mist. Elsie remained at the table for another few seconds, looking at the board as if she were not quite ready to let the evening close over it. Then she began to reach for the pieces. "Leave it," said Arthur quietly. She looked up. "I'll see to it. No point packing away a perfectly good game too fast." Elsie nodded, closed the box lid loosely, and left with her school bag over one shoulder and a look on her face Arthur recognised from long experience. The look of someone who had come in uncertain and gone out with the evening altered for the better. The back table in the snug became theirs, without anybody formally saying so. Arthur simply stopped putting other people there on Thursday evenings and, if challenged, said the light was awkward. The second week it rained so hard the pub windows trembled under it. Water chased itself down the glass in silver threads, and every time the front door opened, a draught came in, smelling of wet pavement, diesel, and cold hedges. Elsie arrived damp to the knees, hair frizzing slightly round the edges. Her chest set wrapped securely in a tea towel she had borrowed from her grandmother's kitchen. Mr. Collins was already there. He rose halfway when he saw her, then seemed to think better of making a fuss and sat down again. Still, the relief on his face reached her before he had time to smooth it away. "You came," he said, before he seemed to mean to say it. Elsie stopped with one hand on the chair back. "I said I would." "Yes," he said, and gave a slight nod. as though correcting himself internally. Of course you did. But something in his face settled at that, and Elsie, who was younger than most people assumed and sharper than many of them realised, noticed it. She did not comment. She only unwrapped the tea towel, set the box on the table, and sat down. You thought I might not. The weather is poor. It's only rain. That is a statement usually made by people not yet 70. She snorted. I'm not made of paper. No, he said, with a look at the chess set. Plainly not. They began. That evening the game took on the deep concentration of weather-bound things. Rain hammered the windows, the fire hissed and shifted, the pieces clicked softly against the board, keeping their own patient time. They spoke little, and yet the silence between them had changed. It was less the silence of strangers and more the silence of people already engaged in the same task. On the way out that evening, Mr. Collins paused at the door and looked back at the board, still set out in its mid-game arrangement, because Elsie had left it for next week. You don't pack away an unfinished game, he said. Elsie was halfway into her coat. Grandpa Joe never did. He said it was bad manners to the pieces. Mr. Collins remained where he was, one hand on the back of a chair. The fire had dropped to a lower glow by then, and the board sat in the warm edge of it, the pieces throwing long little shadows across the squares. Bad manners to the pieces, he repeated, as if trying the phrase for its weight. He said, if a game had more to say, you shouldn't silence it just because it was bedtime. Mr. Collins gave a small breath of laughter. That sounds very like a man who took play seriously. He took everything seriously, said Elsie. Not in a gloomy way, just properly. A rare skill. For a moment he looked not at Elsie but at the board itself, and Arthur, watching from behind the bar, had the distinct impression that he was seeing a different table in a different room, one much quieter and much farther away. Then Mr. Collins nodded, once, with the gravity of a man who had just been reminded of something he had always believed, but never put into words. He was quite right, he said. No sense in rushing an unfinished thing. Elsie pulled on her coat properly and lifted her school bag. See you next week. Next week, he said. After they had gone, Arthur came through to clear the snug. He moved slowly round the room, collecting glasses, straightening chairs, kicking the fire in a little. When he reached the back table, he stopped. The board was still there, half played, full of intention. White pressing on the king's side, black holding firm in the centre. It looked less like a game abandoned for the night than a conversation paused mid-sentence. Arthur put down the glasses. He lifted the board with both hands and carried it carefully to the shelf near the wall where the old quiz folders and spare candlesticks lived, making room for it as if for something delicate. There, he muttered to nobody. That'll do. The snug felt different with the board left out. Less empty, perhaps, as though the room had agreed to hold something in trust until Thursday. The third Thursday, Elsie arrived to find Mr. Collins already seated at the back table, the pieces still in the position they had left them the previous week. His cap lay beside one elbow, and a small notepad sat open near his hand. He closed it, not guiltily exactly, but quickly enough to be noticed. Elsie slid into her chair and narrowed her eyes. Were you analysing it? I was thinking about it, he said, which was not quite the same thing, and both of them knew it. She leaned over the board. That means yes. It means I became curious. That also means yes. To her satisfaction, this won the faintest smile. She liked how sparingly he used them. It made each one feel earned. She studied the position for a while. The board looked different when she came back to it cold, more dangerous in places she had not noticed on the night itself. Mr. Collins had marked nothing on the paper, at least nothing she could see from where she sat, but she was sure he had been tracing lines of attack and defence in that neat, patient way of his. You found something, she said. I found a possibility, he replied. Whether it amounts to anything depends on what you do next. That sounds annoyingly like teaching. Occupational hazard. She looked at him. Do you miss it? The question appeared to take him slightly by surprise. He adjusted a pawn with one fingertip, though it did not need adjusting. Sometimes, he said, not the marking, not staff meetings, not parents who believed little Oliver's inability to divide fractions was a conspiracy designed to suppress his gifts. But the teaching, yes, Elsie laughed. We've got one like that in my year. Only one parent, 3 Olivers. That made him laugh properly, and the sound pleased her more than she expected. She settled both elbows on the table and looked at the board again. Right then, she said, show me this possibility. I'd rather you found it. Cruel? Educational. Those are not always the same thing. No, he conceded, but tonight they might overlap. Elsie bent over the board. Outside, rain tapped softly at the window. Near the bar, Sarah Logan was saying something about fairy lights in the tone of a woman already regretting having volunteered for decorations. The pub moved around them, but at the back table the game resumed, as if the week between had merely been a long pause for thought. The week had brought preparations for the village talent night, and half the pub appeared to be involved in some dispute about lighting, chairs, and whether Tom Armitage's accordion should ever be heard in public again. Through all of it, Elsie and Mr. Collins played on, enclosed by their own concentration. Arthur, polishing glasses, found himself remembering Mr. Collins from before his wife died, when he had been a quieter version of the same man, rather than a withdrawn one. Grief had not made him unkind, only more distant. He had simply stopped expecting much. By the 4th Thursday, watching him lean over the board and answer one of Elsie's sharp remarks with a smile, Arthur thought he looked more like himself again. They had acquired the ease of habit by then. You taught maths, Elsie said, during a long pause. For 37 years. Did you like it? He considered the question. Mostly. Children are often more sensible than adults, provided you don't tell them so. She gave him a quick grin. And why did you stop? He moved a bishop before answering. Margaret was ill. It seemed the sensible thing. She must have liked having you home. He smiled at the memory. She said I was under her feet by the 2nd afternoon. Elsie laughed properly at that. She was right, mind you, he added. I was dreadful at retirement. Still am some days. The 5th Thursday brought the first proper cold of the season. The fire in the snug had been banked higher than usual, and the windows had begun to gather condensation at their edges. Elsie arrived with her coat buttoned to the collar and her cheeks pink from the walk. Mr. Collins had already ordered her a hot chocolate without being asked, which she noticed and did not remark on, though something in the way she sat down was less guarded than it had been at the start. It did not take long for the village to notice that the notice had, in its quiet way, been answered. Sarah Logan noticed first because Sarah noticed anything that altered the emotional weather of a room. She came in one Thursday with a crate of tonic water and saw Elsie already halfway through a hot chocolate at the back table, while Mr. Collins considered a move with complete absorption. Sarah did not go over. She only stood for a moment, smiling to herself, before carrying on to the bar. Well, she murmured to Arthur as she paid, keeping her voice low. That seems to have sorted itself. Arthur followed her glance and gave a small grunt that, from him, counted as agreement. You knew, said Sarah. I suspected. Same thing in your case. He didn't answer, which confirmed it. Nora Field noticed in a different way. She noticed because she saw Mr. Collins crossing the square on Thursday evenings, with more purpose than usual, and because she once passed Elsie heading the same way, chess box tucked under her arm and expression fixed in that determined style teenagers adopt when they do not wish to be considered adorable. Nora, who had pinned the card up in the first place, felt a private satisfaction she mentioned to nobody. Lucy Carter heard about it from 3 separate people at the station in the space of 5 days, which in Little Mizzlewick generally meant the thing was now settled fact. Cinders received this information with complete indifference from the booking office windowsill. Lucy scratched behind one orange ear and looked out towards the square. "You see," she told him, "you can ask the village for things after all." Cinders blinked once and resumed sleeping. The 6th Thursday arrived with autumn properly settled over the village. Leaves lay pasted darkly to the pavement outside, and the pub had taken on that deeper sort of warmth that only appeared once the evenings had begun closing in for good. Coats hung thicker on the pegs by the door, the windows steamed faintly at the corners. The fire in the snug had that settled orange glow which made people lower their voices without quite meaning to. Thursdays. By then, Thursday evenings had acquired their own shape. Elsie arrived after school, sometimes with a piece of homework she ignored entirely, sometimes with a story about a teacher, a form tutor, a classroom injustice, or a ridiculous assembly. Mr. Collins listened with the attention of a man who had once spent a lifetime taking the concerns of the young seriously and had not entirely lost the habit. In return, he had begun, little by little, to offer fragments of himself. A school trip snowed in near Shrewsbury, a headmaster who believed every difficulty could be solved by Latin, a disastrous attempt to run a chess club for first years who preferred using the knights as horses in invented battles. None of it was intimate in an obvious sense, yet the accumulation of these small offerings had altered something. They no longer met as 2 people who happened to sit across a board. They met as people who expected by now to be known. That evening, Mr. Collins had already moved her hot chocolate slightly nearer the fire before she sat down, and Elsie had noticed without drawing attention to it. The game was halfway through, the position tense but balanced, when she looked up from the board and said, as if it had only just occurred to her, though, in truth, she had been thinking it for some time. "It was you, wasn't it? The notice!" Mr. Collins's hand paused above a rook. He set it down carefully before answering. "Yes," he said. She waited. "My wife and I played every Thursday evening for 42 years, he said, after supper, at the kitchen table. His eyes remained on the board as he spoke, and Elsie had the sense that he was not avoiding her exactly, only looking somewhere she could not yet see. "She was very good," he went on. "Merciless, actually. She had a way of looking entirely uninterested just before doing something devastating to your queen." Elsie smiled. "That sounds effective." "It was infuriating." A faint smile touched his mouth. "I adored it." The fire shifted behind them with a soft collapse of ash. At the bar, somebody asked Arthur for another half. The ordinary sounds of the pub seemed, for a moment, very far off. "When Margaret died," Mr. Collins said, "the board stayed where it was for a long while. Longer than made sense, probably. I kept thinking I'd put it away properly and never did." His hand rested lightly on the table, not moving. People talk about silence as though it's simply the absence of noise, but it isn't. Not really. A house has its own sort of conversation when 2 people have lived in it a long time. Kettle, footsteps, a chair pulled out, a question from the other room. You stop noticing it while it's there. Then, one day it's gone, and the whole place sounds wrong. Elsie said nothing. She understood enough not to interrupt. "The kitchen felt especially wrong on Thursdays," he said. I would look at the table and think, absurdly, that if I waited a moment longer, she might still appear with the pieces under her arm and accuse me of trying to choose white before she got there." He paused for a moment, then continued. "So I wrote the card. It seemed a small enough thing to ask. Not company in general. That would have felt too large somehow. Only a game, only an evening. Something with rules. Something I remembered how to do." He looked up then. "I did not expect the village to send me, a 14-year-old with a weakness for reckless sacrifices." Elsie's mouth twitched. "You're welcome." He smiled at that. Elsie looked at him for a moment, then at the board. Her own grief was not the same shape as his, but she knew enough about the strange persistence of ordinary objects after someone had gone. A mug still in the cupboard, a coat still on a hook, a habit with nowhere to go. "Well," she said after a pause, just long enough to honour what he had told her. "You did ask the village, and the village sent me." He laughed then, and there was moisture in his eyes when he removed his glasses and wiped them with his handkerchief. "Yes," he said. "It appears it did." Elsie shifted a pawn. "So are you going easy on me because this is all tragically meaningful now?" "Certainly not." "Good." "In fact," he said, replacing his glasses and looking down at the board with renewed seriousness, "I feel bound to punish that last move on principle." "There it is," said Elsie. "That's more like it." The game resumed, and the relief of that was part of the kindness. Nothing had become solemn beyond recovery. Nothing needed arranging into a lesson. He had told her something true, and then, because truth did not end a Thursday evening, they carried on. From then on, the games became fixed in the rhythm of the week. The competition remained genuine. Elsie still gambled too much. Mr. Collins still built quiet traps. But the game had become more than the game by then, and both of them knew it. He liked that she never treated him as fragile. She liked that he took her seriously, from the first move to the last. By the 7th Thursday, Arthur no longer needed excuses to keep the back table free. People had absorbed the arrangement in the way villages absorb all unofficial arrangements that work well enough. No one asked to sit there on Thursdays. If someone new wandered in and looked towards the snug, Sarah Logan or Nora Field, or on one memorable occasion, Reverend B herself would say in tones of gentle certainty, "Oh, that table's taken." Taken was not quite the word for it, Arthur sometimes thought. Reserved, perhaps, or entrusted. He watched Elsie arrive, shaking rain from her sleeves, and Mr. Collins rise slightly in greeting before she had even reached the table. It was a tiny movement, hardly visible if you were not looking for it. Arthur was looking for it. He had seen enough of village life to know that companionship rarely announced itself grandly. More often it built itself out of repeated small courtesies, until one day everyone realised it had become indispensable. As they packed away the pieces that night, Elsie said, as she now did every week, "Same time next Thursday." Mr. Collins put on his cap and gave her a look of mock sternness. "If you promise not to sacrifice half your side for the sake of theatrics." "Can't do that," she said. "Grandpa Joe always said, fortune favours the bold." Mr. Collins was quiet for a moment. He settled his cap and looked at her with something that was not quite a smile and not quite sadness, but had the quality of both. "He was right," he said. "About most things, I'd imagine." "He was," said Elsie. Arthur, hearing this from behind the bar, smiled into the till. They left separately, Elsie into the lively muddle of family life, Mr. Collins toward the quiet of Ivy Cottage, but each carried the same settled feeling. Something had been restored, not all at once and not with any fuss, simply by turning up, week after week, and sitting across a board from someone who understood the value of attention. The notice had asked a small question. In the warm corner of a village pub, it had found its answer. Next morning, Nora made her usual round with the drawing pins rattling gently in their tin. The harvest poster had begun to peel. Mrs. Pembridge's scarf notice had bowed in the damp. The cream card had curled at the corners. She eased it free and held it in her palm. It had done what it came to do. Nora looked across the square and thought of Elsie's quicker step on a Thursday evening, of the laughter now heard from Mr. Collins's corner of the snug. Some notices asked for things. Others made room for them. Instead of putting the card in the bin, she slipped it into the little tin among the drawing pins and closed the lid. The board looked tidy again, ready for the next small matter, the next request, the next quiet shift in village life. And in the tin, lay one card. Wanted a chess partner.
In Little Mizzlewick, even the smallest notice can open a door. Thank you for listening, and remember, where small stories have big hearts.